This is another iRaw podcast.
Hi, I'm Emilia Lees, and welcome to the latest episode of Think Like a Vegan podcast, a companion to our book, also entitled Think Like a Vegan. There's new bros in town, and they're all about being an altruist and being effective. Sounds good, right? Making altruism be as effective as possible. Amazing. Is it though? How do we measure an act meant to benefit another? How do we decide its effectiveness and for whom it's effective? For the beneficiary? For the actor? And why? Why should we be thinking about effectiveness when we're talking about doing something that's meant to do good or change minds? On today's episode, I'm honored to host Alice Crary and Lori Gruen. Along with Carol J. Adams, they're the editors of a collection of critical essays on effective altruism entitled The Good It Promises, The Harm It Does. And it's published by Oxford University Press. We couldn't have two people better placed to talk about this topic. Welcome, Alice and Lori.
Thank you very much, Emmy.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Thank you so much. In addition to being the editors of the collection, Alice contributed an essay entitled Against Effective Altruism, where she analyzes what is effective altruism, or EA as it's usually referred to, and why it's a terrible practice. And Lori's contribution, entitled The Change We Need, looks at existing practices which are already creating a different world. Before we hear from Alice and Lori, here's a bit of background about them. They're both absolutely prolific authors of books and articles, and they often collaborate. Their body of work is astonishing and inspiring. Seriously, have a look at their websites. Alice is a distinguished professor of philosophy at the New School for Social Research. She's a visiting fellow at Regent's Park College in the University of Oxford and at the Zolberg Institute on Migration and Mobility. Her website is alicecrary.com, and I'll put that in the notes. Lori is the William Griffin Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Science in Society at Wesleyan University, where she also coordinates Wesleyan Animal Studies. And you can see all her work at lorigruen.com. Before we hear from Alice and Lori, I want to read you a snippet from the foreword to The Good It Promises, The Harm It Does. And the foreword is by Amia Srinivasan. The movement known as effective altruism is true to its name in at least one way. It has proven enormously effective at promoting itself and winning powerful adherents. The story of the consequences of effective altruism success has so far been told by those adherents. For them, the success of effective altruism is near definitionally a moral good. With that, Alice and Lori, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Emmy. Again, we're delighted to be here. And I thought what I would do is just talk a little bit about what effective altruism is in case some of your listeners aren't familiar with it. It's a program for making charitable giving rational, for letting individuals do the most good, showing them how to do the most good per expenditure of time or money. And it can seem utterly unobjectionable. You know, what could be wrong with trying to do the most good, especially in a world pervaded by deep-seated structural injustice in which there's so much suffering. And so in that sense, it really requires a bit of thought. And it may also be unclear why we're talking to you about it here on the Think Like a Vegan podcast, which we're delighted to be doing, and how animals figure into it. So just a little bit of background. We're basically starting in about 2011, a bit more than a decade ago. And we have some Oxford-affiliated philosophers who are roughly working with a moral theory, that of utilitarianism, and they're thinking about how to get people to give money in the most effective ways to address animal suffering and human suffering around the globe. And And so we have the two most famous exponents, or the two that people are likely to have heard of are Toby Ord and Bill McCaskill. And they founded a couple of organizations in 2009, Giving What We Can and 80,000 Hours. And then went on in late 2011, early 2012 to found the Center for Effective Altruism. And it really rapidly grew, so that we're talking about a network now of organizations that are recommending grants and bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars with pledges of billions, tens of billions of dollars. And the reason we're talking about it here is that two of the original cause areas of effective altruism are the misery of global poverty and the suffering of animals in industrial agriculture. What I wanted to make two comments about the background, just really quickly. And one is that effective altruism is often seen as having roots in philosophy, as I just described. And Peter Singer's work, Peter Singer's bound to be known to most of your listeners, is taken to be foundational for work he was doing back in the early 70s, thinking about how utilitarian principles could actually launch a pretty radical program of social interventions. But what's less well known is that effective altruism also has roots in finance and big tech. And so it's just worth knowing that two analysts at a large hedge fund in 2007 started GiveWell, which is thought of as one of the organizations in the effective altruism ecosystem. They were trying to take their finance principles to develop a more rational approach to philanthropy. And Singer wrote about them in a 2009 book called The Life You Can Save. And that group became closely related with Toby Ord's and Bill McCaskill's Giving What We Can. And they also inspired at the same time tech money-fueled philanthropy that came into the fold. An organization called Good Ventures, which became Open Philanthropy. Let me hand off to Lori.
Thanks, Alice. So I think that was a really great background on some of the history. And I wanted to just add a couple of thoughts about why it is that how it is, both why and how we came to put the book together. The book, as Emmy suggested, The Good It Promises, the Harm It Does, is a collection of essays. And it came about based on, I would suggest, years of recurring conversations amongst various animal activists, and collects a bunch of essays from activists and some scholars on the dangers of effective altruism. And there hadn't really been a book that looked at these dangers. As you said in the introduction, Emmy, from Our Forward by Amia, that they are very, very good at promoting how good they are, and there's very little criticism. And so part of what was motivating us is to think about how it was that various animal activists have been actually harmed by the effective altruist movement. So, for example, many sanctuary directors of sanctuaries that provide lifelong care for farmed animals, talked together and also with us and in their essays in the volume about how their newly effective altruist admiring kind of funders started to suggest that caring for animals in sanctuary and feeding them was ineffective given the mass numbers of animals that are used in capitalist industrial animal agriculture. Or, for example, community activists that were working in marginalized communities based on race and animal issues or class and animal issues. And they spoke to us about how the EA funders had told them that their work in community organizing wasn't effective. And vegans of color also were really expressing concern about the predominantly white and predominantly male orientation of the effective altruists, and that tended to favor these methods to measure effectiveness that are based on really kind of elite, predominantly white campaigns that are designed to change consumer habits, and talking about different kinds of products like alternative meats that aren't based in animals. And this is the kind of thing that may not have a tremendous traction in communities of color and communities that are more working class. And then, of course, too, there were feminists and Me Too advocates who were describing the ways in which effective altruism included people who really had no interest in thinking hard about organizational work that continued to promote, for example, both sexism implicitly and sometimes explicit sexual exploitation. And so this has been something that has been really lacking in the conversations about effective altruism. And we wanted to bring it all together in the volume that we put together. And I'll turn it back over to Alice.
Yeah, I'm going to pick right up on what Lori was saying. Some of our authors in the book are interested in principle criticisms of effective altruism. Not all of them are, but some of them are. And some of these criticisms are directly related to things Lori was just saying about the engagement of critics of effective altruism with more revolutionary, socially transformative modes of thinking, anti-racist, feminist, anti-colonialist. And the real upshot of one of the earliest criticisms of effective altruism is that it simply doesn't have the resources to deal with structural injustice, with deeply rooted structures of, say, late capitalism that reliably reproduce racism, colonialist structures, forms of imperialism, ableism, and so forth. And there's a history to this criticism in 2015, which is really just a couple of years after the inception of effective altruism as a movement. A group of people working in developmental economics and political theory laid out a critique of effective altruism's inability to deal with structural injustice that became known as the institutional critique. And the idea was that effective altruists are dealing with a damagingly narrow interpretation of the class of things that can be assessed as right or wrong. They're looking at sort of simple interventions that reduce suffering in the short term. And they're looking away from coordinated sets of actions, the kinds of things that social movements are engaged in, especially working in solidarity with each other across communities, which are directed towards changing social structures that reliably cause suffering. And the idea then is that effective altruism is politically problematic because it obscures structural political roots of global misery. And so there's sort of two related problems. It's contributing to the reproduction of misery, and it does so by doing something else which is problematic, which is weakening existing political mechanisms for positive social change. And it's helpful to have a conversation with about these things on here on your podcast, Emmy, because I think that there's a kind of pat response that effective altruists make to this objection that really doesn't hold up very well. So they're aware of this objection. They were pretty respectful of it in 2015, but their idea was they could just internalize it, that the problem was that they weren't, maybe focusing on all the kinds of social interventions they could be, but they would just evaluate those too and pay attention to their consequences and assess them. And if they were effective, then fine, they could be, supporting anti-racist social movements and, movements for climate justice and so forth. But the problem is actually deeper than this, which is why it's helpful to talk about. It's not just a fixable methodological flaw, because they have a top-down image of increase in welfare or other goods as a kind of metric. And they're not paying attention to the need for engaged immanent social thought, which attends to local social values. And they're also not paying attention to the fact that beneficence or spreading more welfare isn't the only value that governs social interventions. There are things like freedom, justice, and democracy, which are really important also. And so, in a sense, what effective altruists are doing is disavowing the very tools they would need to have the kind of occasion sensitivity to address these deeper structural problems that a lot of activists in the animal protectionist movement and other social justice movements are engaged with.
We'll pause for a musical interlude, after which we'll return with more from Alice Crary and Lori Gruen. This piece is from Matthew Gerstenberger, who I've featured in season 2, and he's back for this season. This is Furin Sanpo. Matthew explains this piece has a field recording from one of his favorite shrines in Tokyo, where he often works and has wandered many times and eaten many lunches. The bells are Edo Furin, which are hand-blown glass wind chimes. Each has its own character. These that we're hearing are from his own collection, which unfortunately he dares not put outside in the super strong Wellington winds. Listen to all of Matthew's music on SoundCloud under the name Seismicity. We're back for the second part of Alice Crary and Lori Gruen's discussion on effective altruism.
Okay, I'm just going to bring it into a story of 2 cows that I had the pleasure of meeting at a sanctuary, vine sanctuary in Vermont. There was a small calf who is named Maddox, and many people aren't aware. I'm sure many people who listen to your podcast, Emmy, are aware, but many other people aren't aware of the dairy industry's dirty little secret, which is that many of the male calves that are born on dairies are left to starve. So one really kind person at one point saw Maddox tie a little baby cow tied up to a post and asked the dairy if she could take him in her Subaru. She just put the little cow in the back of her Subaru and brought him up to the sanctuary where he grew and thrived. But 3 years later, his mother, who's called Moxie, was brought to the sanctuary as well. And they immediately recognized one another. There's a beautiful image of the 2 of them touching noses, and it's just fantastic. And I tell the story, there's more to tell you about Maddox and Moxie and how wonderful their relationship is, how their feelings and their concern for one another, their care for each other was so vivid and noticeable. But I use this example just briefly to indicate what would an effective altruist try to measure there, right? These are sanctuaries that are doing amazing work, not just for these individuals and their relationships, but also helping us to figure out that, wow, cows are actually, I'm just confess, I'm a little bit afraid of cows. I'm getting better, but I'm still so big. But we don't really think about cows when we're thinking about reducing the number of cows that are used in capitalist industrial agriculture, that effective altruists are trying to measure. We don't understand or even have, just to reiterate what Alice was saying, the effective altruists have no way of even identifying the beautiful value of the relationship. And one of the things that these sanctuary experiences and stories actually help us is to figure out and motivate our solidarity with farmed animals, and as well as thinking about how we might resist it. And this doesn't really have anything to do with effectiveness. It's hard to even imagine what the metric of effectiveness would be in this little vignette that I'm sharing with you. And so I think this is just one really concrete way of understanding that the metrics that the effective altruists are using are really myths. And they end up focusing on things that can be measured and then suggesting, this is the value, which is the wrong way around. The values are there, and we can recognize and appreciate those values, and they may not be ultimately measurable. And that, I think, is another way of suggesting that the effective altruists really, truly don't have the tools of capturing what's so important for larger issues of human-animal justice and the other forms of injustice that we're also desperately trying to address.
I wanted to pick up and say one thing about the direction that effective altruism has been going. It's shifted in its public profile in recent years, and it's worth saying a word about it because both because it reveals something about its values, and because listeners may hear about effective altruism under a different name. So it's not necessarily the case that the movement has really shifted, but a lot of effective altruists have started presenting themselves as long-termists. That's starting in about 2016. Toby Ord and Bill McCaskill, the two Oxford-affiliated philosophers I mentioned, started using this terminology. And very roughly, they're picking up on a strain of thought that was already there in some of Oxford's institutes and research programs. But the idea is something like to apply utilitarianism to future human beings, worry about the fact that, as they see it, we're at a kind of precipice, as Ord puts it, where we can self-destruct or have a glorious future. And so we should focus on looking at threats to the continued existence of human civilization. They call this existential risk, a phrase that anyone paying attention to discussions about these things is likely to hear. And one thing that someone listening to the conversations about effective altruism may wonder is what happened to animals. So here we have these remade effective, or at least resurfaced effective altruists calling themselves long-termists. They're thinking about future beings. These future beings seem to be primarily human beings, not our fellow creatures on the planet. And one of the reasons for this is that not just that long-termists are thinking about the long-term future and giving it inordinate weight in their reasoning, because they have almost like, I sometimes call it a sci-fi villain's view of the future. They think like, oh, well, we should do absolutely anything. And sometimes those things are like allow a deadly some kind of deadly event that kills lots of people. It's not so bad as long as we can see human civilization getting past it and going on to a glorious future with trillions of people. Eventually. But there's something else, which is that they're blocking out animals even in the way they think about the future, because they're working with really improbable welfare calculations. I'm thinking about what Lori was just saying, these mythical metrics. And they're looking at wild or non-domestic animals and saying they have such low well-being that their dying off isn't a problem. So that their moral calculus is that this isn't a bad thing, actually, because these animals, they weren't contributing to the good state of affairs because they had such poor lives. And they're also engaging a really problematic and questionable narrative about moral progress during the modern period. So the idea is for those animals that are around, human beings are just getting better and better, and so are going to treat them better. And if we look at the last several hundred years in the development of industrial animal agriculture on the sea and on the land, it's really hard to see that narrative making contact with the facts.
Thank you, Alice and Lori. I just want to ask and talk a little bit more about some of the things that you've said and ask you a few questions as well. But first, I want to preface with saying, Lori, I'm afraid of cows too. Not so much when they are on the other side of a fence, but when I have to walk through a field, which I often do here in Scotland, and there are cows present. I need as much distance between me and them as possible. I'm not afraid. I mean, I've been to many places with a lot of different wild animals, and I sort of know what they're going to do. But with the cow, it's just so massive that, so I you said it sheepishly, but I also completely was right there with you. And your work is fantastic, and the way you've set out all of this is great.
Part of the reason that I'm afraid of cows is it's actually the reason I was being a little bit demurring is because in both cases, when I had an experience with younger cows, they wanted to play with me, which is so beautiful, but also them playing with me would involve me probably getting trampled by them. That's why I was nervous about it.
Fair. Absolutely fair and respect. I mean, they are massive, lovely and massive. One of the things that I've taken away from your work is EA basically is capitalism on steroids, and kind of wanting to make or insert. Doing good or moral practice by capitalizing on it. And that's a truly frightening thing because, and I'm paraphrasing Angela Davis here, we're trying to fix capitalism with more capitalism. So we're trying to fix all these problems, some of which are caused by capitalism, some of which are not necessarily a direct cause of capitalism, but it's a systemic issue, as you have also said. And we're trying to use those same methods in something that has nothing to do with it. And it's as if subscribers of EA or proponents of EA just want to use those same tools to make the problems that have been created go away. And that it's circular. It just becomes a circular thing and never actually looking at the issues. And I've come across this in real life as well. Is that a correct sense that I have of the matter?
Go ahead, Alice.
It seems fair enough. It does seem right. I work with a lot of students who, one of the ways I think it's fair to say that Lori and I both entered into a discussion about these things by various different routes, and to some extent weren't looking to have this conversation, but felt like we had to have it. And one of the routes into it that I came from involve students who are very drawn to it. So I do think it's important in everything I write to acknowledge that a lot of the sort of low entry level and sometimes researchers and even higher level figures in the movement are genuinely idealistic and committed. So they're looking desperately for ways to say, like, there are so many problematic things in the world and so many ways that speaking of themselves, that I try to do things don't make a difference. And so how can I do something that makes a difference? And here I can give money or work for an organization that is giving money to or time to some program, working with some company that's changing the treatment of animals in factory farms, or that's engaged in some health intervention in the global south. And at least I can see that something's happening. I agree with your analysis, but I think to talk to people who are attracted to effective altruism, we also have to acknowledge how it looks to them. And then to say, well, let's look at the world. Let's look, especially historically. History really gets lost in effective altruism. Let's look at historically the world in which these desperate problems that are on your mind are so deeply rooted.
I agree with what Alice said, of course, but I also wanted to just add that, it is true that utilitarianism is sort of not opposed to capitalism. It's very much in a similar kind of sort of maximization and aggregation logic, right? So there is, and there's many effective altruists who say they're not utilitarians, but ultimately, when you're looking at effectiveness or efficiency, you're right in that model, right? And so I think that Emmy's also sort of right. I think there is a sense in which so much of what ends up happening is in the conversations about effective altruism is really putting band-aids on problems within the system. So I remember a conversation that we had about ventilation shutdown, which is an absolutely ghastly way of dying one way or the other. But the debate ended up being, should there be gas? Should the heat just exist, or should there also be gases involved, so that like poisonous gas and heat? And I thought to myself, this is grotesque. This is the conversation that we're having about ventilation shutdown. Why not go straight after the capitalist model of agricultural production? But no, that wasn't what was happening. We had to sort of think about what was going to cause the least harm and cause the animals to die quickly and less painfully. It's mind-boggling the way you get tied into those kinds of conversations really quickly when you're in this sort of conversations about what's the most effective thing to do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Exactly right. Where we're not zooming out, but we're looking at the problem from a really a micro perspective. And I think your point as well, Alice, that about history and about intentions. Intentions are good. I don't doubt that. And I think that there's just this lack of thinking critically or patiently, even, because things take time. It didn't take us 5 minutes to get to where we are. It took, if we're looking at from a historical perspective, and we're just looking at from an agricultural perspective, has taken us 10,000 years to get here. And I also, and as you said, especially when you're dealing with students, I totally appreciate that feeling that you have all the energy and that wanting to do something as quickly as possible and to make a better place and a better world for yourself and everyone around you, including animals and so forth. So I think that's a really thoughtful and a really important point. Then I want to ask a couple more questions. Are there some other people whose work people might want to be interested in looking at?
Absolutely. I think I want to answer that. I'll start answering that question by going back to your previous question, because one of the responses of effective altruisms to the kinds of criticisms that we're providing space for in this book is that there really is no alternative. That's often the suggestion that there is nothing else that has an impact, and critics are sometimes sort of panned with the suggestion that they haven't presented some other way to effectively do good. And one of the things that's happening there is they're internalizing their worldview and therefore blocking the work of people in working in NGOs and in social justice movements of all different sorts around the world that are very long-standing. But one of the things that we're trying to do in the book, I think we even say this in the introduction, is a project of recovery. To say it's actually not up to us to come up with a wild set of alternatives, but to show how the effective altruist movement actually depends on blocking out the contributions of so many people who have been speaking long before they came on the scene. And so that is one of the things that we're doing in this book, and we're drawing attention to all kinds of really exciting thinkers. So I'll mention one contribution, but I really want it to be clear that I admire all the authors in the book. So we have, for instance, a biologist and developmental psychologist who's Brazilian, Simone de Lima, who's also an intersectional animal advocate. And she is exposing what I would call, I don't think she uses these words, a kind of epistemic colonialism, which is characteristic of effective altruism. And her work is just fabulous in offering a demonstration of how damaging it can be to have top-down social intervention with prefabricated metrics in the way that effective altruists do, coming into a country that has its own history of modes of agriculture, of animal advocacy, anti-cruelty laws. And instead of paying attention to the history and culture and context, simply top-down applying their own metrics in ways that often partner with big meat companies. These are things that Simone de Lima brings out really beautifully. Meat companies, which are some of the biggest antagonists in terms of things like deforestation, abuse of workers' rights, and also just directly harms to animals. So yeah. Anyway, but we could mention everyone in the book, and I wanted to mention that case in particular as a way of bringing out another way in which metrics of or the myth of the metric in effective altruism can be really damaging.
And absolutely. And actually, this brings me back to something Lori and I were talking about before we even started recording, and about the funding and how the funding itself can then perpetuate the structures, the EA structures, because the funding will only go to people who subscribe to the metrics and to people who put forth the ideas that are going to appeal to EA funders. And EA funders have a ton of money. So they're, in essence, they're dictating and even crowding out, or maybe even discouraging, or people, if they go and they ask these EA folks for funding and then they say no, well then their own projects, they feel like, gosh, don't people see all that we're doing and all that we're trying to do and everyone that we're trying to help, everyone, including animals and humans. Everyone always includes that for me. So I find that to be really worrisome and upsetting. And Lori and I were having a talk. Do you want to say anything about that, Lori? Have you come across that in your experience?
Yeah, it is really important. And there's two ways in which at least two ways in which it's problematic. One way that it's problematic is that it forces people to try to figure out how to measure things that they wouldn't ordinarily measure. So in some ways, and that's not an easy issue for people who are working on really important social justice issues, is to spend time figuring out how to count this or that or another to show the funders that they actually are quote unquote effective. That may not be the most appropriate or dare I say effective use of time. But so there's a way in which some activists may find themselves pressured into trying to translate what they do into the language and methods of effective altruism, which I think is difficult and problematic. But also, I think that to a large extent, and this is part of the reason why I raised the issue of the demographics of the effective altruist movement, which is predominantly white and predominantly male, is that there's a sense in which, going back to what Alice was saying about a certain sort of epistemic injustice, if you will. The idea here is that many of the folks who are engaged in figuring out who to fund and how to fund them can't really understand what's happening in communities that they're not familiar with, particularly communities of color or Black communities, vegans of color working in poorer neighborhoods and places in which the most effective, quote unquote, action is going to not be transferable or translatable to the effective altruist. So there's two senses in which I think that this progress that the quote unquote effective altruists are making is a problem, right? It leads to good work having to be measured in a particularly constrained way. And it also just simply excludes because people aren't understanding, the funders aren't understanding what's necessary and what's needed on the ground in communities of color and the activist work that's being done there. So I think those are two really important features of the problem of funding. There's more, of course, but those are two important ones.
Yeah, of course. I mean, and this is why I think that it's such an important conversation to be having. I think it's, to some extent, it's happening more in the US. And obviously you're there and you're leading this conversation. And it's starting to happen here in the UK and in Europe. So I am so happy that your book exists, that your collection exists. And I really hope that plenty of people read it and follow your work. And in fact, that now leads me to another question, a final question. Where can people follow your work online? And do you have any projects that you'd like to promote?
You start, Lori.
Well, one project I'd like to promote, which is the book that Alice and I wrote, called Animal Crisis. And it is a book that tries to address, in some of the ways that we've been talking about, the general sort of limitations of animal ethics and animal sort of activism that's moved by the more what we call traditional animal ethics, and instead to think, again, more historically and in the tradition of critical social theory, how to place our relationships with other animals and the various structures and practices that currently exist into a framework where we can imagine real profound social change. Not just for humans and other humans, but also for other animals. So I'd really recommend people look at our book, Animal Crisis. You can find me online at lorigruen.com, and I'm on various social media occasionally as well.
That works for me too. I'm available online at alicecrary.com, and I for me, working with Lori on that book was wonderful, and I agree, it's a great place to turn attention.
Thanks again, Alice and Lori. Again, I'm absolutely grateful you've taken time out of your schedule to come and to talk to us today. And I really hope that this, your book and your work has a tremendous effect on people. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us, Emmy.
I listened to a talk by Black American scholar, activist, and long-term vegan Angela Davis, and she critiqued our assimilation of capitalist ideas and terminology into our activism. She particularly pointed out it was ludicrous to think about activism in terms of efficiency, because the more we learn, the more our activism changes. And what that means is even what we ask for, the changes we hope to make, the why and how to make them, can and will shift with time and experience. So it's absurd to stuff activism and altruism, I believe the two are indivisible, into a metric which is at the core of capitalism. The efficiency of production so we can make more, faster, and more profitable. Capitalism is excellent at subsuming or swallowing up everything, but we can be thoughtful about what we let ourselves be forced into accepting. In our activism or altruism, we don't have to paint ourselves into artificial corners of thought imposed on us by the non-vegan capitalist world, or heck, even the vegan capitalist world. Doing so benefits no one but the status quo. Whether with respect to veganism or any other issue related to justice, altruism and activism are things meant to change not only material circumstances, but minds and hearts to some extent, too. Irrespective of whether we like it, these changes take time, and they're not linear. There's no shortcuts to the work we have to do. And in a 1999 speech that Davis gave on the prison industrial complex, which is available on Spotify along with a number of her other speeches, which was an incredible find for me, I didn't know, Davis says, "I want to begin by suggesting that whoever you are, wherever you are, whether you're a student, an academic, a worker, whether you're a person involved in your church, whether you're an artist, there's always ways to gear your work towards progressive, radical transformation. So I say, go to it wherever you are, and don't let anyone hem you in for efficiency's sake."
We tear things up when we go round. We burn things up when we go round. We speed things up when we go round.
That's it from me, Emmy Leese. Thank you for listening. Remember, you can get in touch by email at thinklikeaveganbook@gmail.com. You can find more of my work and upcoming events on my website, emilialeese.com, and social media. Subscribe to this podcast, share it with others, and leave us a review. And buy a copy of Think Like a Vegan anywhere you buy books and audiobooks, or request it from your local library. Production credit goes to Jim Moore of Bloody Vegans Productions. Theme music provided by Jenny Moore's Mystic Business from the eponymous album. The opening tune is Flashbacks, and we close with Tear Things Up. The interval music is by Matthew Gerstenberger, aka Seismicity, on SoundCloud.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.